But the challenge will be for some board chairs not to manage the business. And in corporate governance, there's a saying, nose in, fingers out. So, the board chair needs to know what's going on.
Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who address the challenges and best practices to deliver your message effectively. That might be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is George O'Neill. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about George. 1, he started his career as an aerospace engineer. That was for the first 10 years, putting things up in space. His last corporate role was CEO of an $8 billion real estate trade association and multiple listing service. And over the years, he's been promoted from engineering into management and ultimately CEO and board director positions. He has experience in both public and private technology-focused companies, specifically helping manage the CEO and board relationship. George O'Neill, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Well, thank you, George. It's great to be here.
Great to talk with you. And today we're going to explore the board communication. How do we communicate with a board? How does the board communicate with management? What are the challenges? And maybe what are some tips, some lessons you've learned the hard way along the way? George, as in corporate boards, you certainly have experience being one of the employees, one of the managers, executives communicating with the board. Tell me some of the messages that the board needs to hear, and perhaps the challenges in presenting those messages to the board without getting into too much detail every time talk to the board. Do they really want all that detail? How do you draw the line? How do you know to deliver the right message?
The last company that I worked for, last large company, right now I'm on running my own startup, but last large company I worked for that I reported to the board, it was some judgment needed to be required every time we reported formally to the board. We had board meetings pretty much every month, although it wasn't scheduled on a monthly basis, but it ended up being about roughly once a month. But we would prepare the information to send to the board ahead of time. So it was critical to communicate the information prior to the board meeting, and that's done through the previous minutes of the previous board meeting, plus information associated with the key topics, the key activities of the business, essentially the key KPIs, which would already be defined for the year, report on those, and then any critical items that the board should be aware of. And choosing those items sometimes are very, very obvious. So if they were in the KPIs, if they're already in the board plan, the strat plan for the year, we would obviously update the board members. Sometimes things will come up unplanned, and it was, of course, my judgment as a CEO to determine what would be reported to the board. And I like to err, if you err in any way, is on the side of more communication than less. You don't want to surprise anybody. So the board package that will go out 7 days prior to the board meeting, and we religiously made sure we sent that board package, would contain written information on all those topics. And that board package could be well over 100 pages. So being a board member, requires a lot of work, a lot of diligence. And the expectation was those board members would read that information and be prepared. And that information would not necessarily be discussed at the board meeting. It'd be the implications of that information would be discussed. So selecting what information to choose absolutely is critical, and that is one of the roles of the CEO and his or her senior team.
George, is the role of the board, is it always clear within the organization? And who sets the definition, the parameters of that role?
It should be clear, but you're right. It's not always clear, and that's heavily the role that the board chair plays is heavily influences how effective that board will be. So essentially, the way the corporate governance in general looks, and certainly the way I've been trained and the way I look at it and the experience I've had, in simple terms, the board chair manages the board, and I manage the company, and I report to the board, not just through the board chair. I report to the entire board, but the board chair and the CEO typically have a strong relationship because the board chair is tasked with running that board effectively. And oftentimes the first stop for me, if there's an issue that I want to escalate to the board, would be through the board chair. If there's ambiguity in what the board members' roles are, that's really a board chair responsibility. And as well, from there, a CEO. So if the CEO knows there's ambiguity, then of course the CEO needs to work with the board chair and the rest of the board and get those roles clarified. Typically, there is a document that clearly defines what the roles and responsibilities are. If people are effectively executing those, the board will work like a finely tuned clock. But sometimes directors come in with expectations. Sometimes directors come in and don't read the material. And that's where there can be problems, especially if the board chair doesn't keep that in alignment. A good board chair will see those indicators of a board member not stepping up and performing his or her responsibilities as they should, maybe not having read the appropriate documentation, not following the rules, the bylaws, and that's where the board chair should deal with it. And we're there somewhat as an advisor to the board, as well as fully reporting to the board.
George, you mentioned the relationship between the board chair and the CEO. That relationship, I'm curious, what would be an ideal relationship, and what are the types of relationships that you've experienced and heard about that are more likely to happen?
Sure. So an ideal relationship with a board chair and a CEO is the board chair. I mean, in an ideal world, and I've worked with board chairs like this in different companies. The board chair is very proactive, and sizes up, quite frankly, the CEO. So let's use just a quick scenario. So if either a board chair is new to a company or the CEO is new to a company, a good board chair will be very proactive, not only reach out to obviously all the directors and get to know the directors, but also reach out to the CEO and get to know the CEO personally, and meet for lunch, meet for dinner, meet for drinks, certainly get together and talk and come to not only a understanding sort of formally how the business is operated and the parameters of the business and the bylaws and the rules and regulations that the company has established for itself, and how governance is run in that business, but as well just on a personal level to understand that CEO and understand that board chair and how those two individuals can communicate effectively. I don't want to say outside the rules, but because that might sound like it's not appropriate, but just like, you don't always need rules to be effective, right? You know where the guardrails are. Guardrails on a road are there. You don't want to hit the guardrails, but you have freedom within the guardrails, to use an analogy on a road. So good relationship between a CEO and a board chair. The board chair will be proactive and reach out, because there is hierarchy here. I mean, the CEO needs to respect the board chair, obviously. The CEO reports to the board of directors, and the board chair heavily influences the success of that CEO. And so I would look at it as a board chair being proactive, reach out to the CEO, get to know the CEO. If that's not happening, obviously the CEO should reach out and get to know that chair effectively. So that's the ideal relationship. And the CEO is on top of matters. So the board chair and the CEO can talk obviously between meetings. Some companies, the CEO some companies, the board chair is more active in, might even have an office. In fact, a lot of companies, it's common they'll have an office in the company, but they may not necessarily be there physically every day. But the challenge will be for some board chairs not to manage the business. And in corporate governance, there's a saying, nose in, fingers out. So, the board chair needs to know what's going on and is entitled to know what's going on. The CEO is responsible to make sure the board chair is comfortable with what's going on. But the CEO is running the business, and the good board chair knows when to kind of leave just hands off, trust the CEO, let them, do their job. If the CEO is not delivering, then that's a different story, right? Obviously, maybe a trust relationship, and there needs to be a change there. But that's kind of an ideal relationship, sort of nose in, fingers off, proactive, get to know that CEO. Now, examples of things that can go wrong. If those things aren't working, I mean, probably the number one problem that I've seen in different companies. I mean, I used to be a management consultant, so I worked with a lot of different companies as an advisor, and we saw this when we would attend some board meetings. And when I was a CEO, I worked for a number of years, and the board members would change, and the chair would change. One company I worked at, the chair would change every year. So it was like just a continuous education of the board chair in a way. And some of those board chairs came with, quite frankly, inappropriate expectations for the role. And that tended to be sort of in the nonprofit sector. But a professional board chair who is there for multiple years, normally there's such a vetting process to select that board chair. That will be, generally a good board chair, and they know when to get involved and they know when to back off. So that having the board chair starting to manage the business, that's the typical problem that I've seen.
And a CEO communicating with a board, and when there's problems in the communication, perhaps the personalities are clashing, perhaps the expectations are simply different views. How can a CEO manage the board? What tools does a CEO have?
Right. So, and this actually happened in one of the companies that I worked at with me, and unfortunately for really everybody involved, because it didn't need to go down this way, but I exited the company. Because the environment and the expectations were just wrong. And it didn't need to go that way. It was a waste of resources, a waste of a lot of talent, a waste of time. So an example of what a CEO can do if they see things potentially going sideways, not, the board chair specifically, or the board in general, sort of not carrying their weight. The CEO, obviously the first starting point is to the board chair, make the case to the board chair that there are issues, be very transparent about those issues, and be very transparent about the impact to the business. And hopefully, that board chair, if they really are paying attention, and most do, but if they're really paying attention, they'll address it. If you're not getting a resolution just with the board chair, it gets very tricky. It's not easy. You don't want to be seen as going around the board chair, going to other board members, but it is an entire board issue. I remember one time in another case, I had a situation where the chair and I agreed to disagree respectfully, and I told the board chair I would take the matter to the entire board. So that's and that's not going around anybody. That's the proper process. If there's a breakdown for some reason hopefully it's just a specific matter, it's not an entire. There's a breakdown on a specific matter, the CEO wants to go in one direction, the board chair is suggesting another direction, then obviously take that matter to the entire board and bounce it around, and the board decision will ultimately rule the day, and then the CEO has to follow the board decision. But if it's a personality breakdown, much more tricky, but the same mechanism applies. If there's any kind of breakdown between the chair and the CEO, the conversation, they sort of, I guess, agree to disagree, and then the professional approach is the matter gets taken to the entire board, and a board that understands their real role, they should strike an independent committee to deal with that matter and get it resolved, and find a way to get either resolution or whatever change may be required, whether that's changing the CEO or changing the board chair, or those are the tools. You have to work with the board. They're the ultimate responsibility. And legally, they have the ultimate responsibility for the company as well.
George, in your role as a CEO, what decisions would you feel the board would be justified? What types of decisions would they be justified in making, and where should they just back off and let you do your job?
So I would say anything that's in the strategic plan. And this is a topic sort of in the corporate governance circles lately that's I would say has been shifting over the years. It used to be the strategic plan for the company was basically almost a total purview of the CEO and the senior executive team, and they would review it with the board. And there might be a couple of days offsite strategic planning session with the board, with a number of the different exercises. But essentially, the board, the CEO would have come to the board with a strategic plan for that year, the next 3 years, next 5 years, typically. So let's say the next 1 to 3 year strategic plan. And this would be going back maybe 5 years ago. Typically, the CEO would come to the board and kind of present the strategic plan and get it blessed. Yeah, there'd be good ideas presented. There might be some minor changes, but pretty much blessed. Now, corporate governance, the boards are taking a more involved role in helping develop the strategic plan. But then they really still need to let the CEO and the senior management team execute that plan. So I would say, developing the plan, absolutely today, the boards have a more involved role. So a 1 or 2 day boondoggle offsite, golf half a day, have nice dinners, have a consultant come in and talk about a topic, and then review for an hour strategic plan. That doesn't cut it anymore. Really involved boards get involved in more detail. There's so many factors going on in the world that they require board attention. So the board gets much more involved in developing the strategic plan. But once the strategic plan is developed, approved formally by the board, and the measurements associated with that strategic plan to know how management is going to execute it. So again, kind of the KPI thinking. The board should let management execute that and have management report back on a frequent basis, report back the status, and fully expect the CEO to raise to the board anything outside of that plan or anything that potentially could be looking like it's coming over the horizon outside of that plan.
George, I've noticed over the past, and I don't remember how many years, but I'm noticing more where board members or people who want to become board members go through some sort of certification training, and then, gladly announce it in the paper that they've been certified. Why do you believe people are doing that? Is there more expectations, higher expectations of board members? Have they just finally caught up with becoming more professional, realizing that they really do have more responsibility than they used to think they had?
So I've got two thoughts on this. One, I don't want to be critical, but I think there's an element of this, and I think this is more broad than just director education. So let me just start with that, and then we'll talk more about the positive side of it. So the first point that comes to my mind is kind of, all advanced schools, advanced degrees, and I'm guilty. I mean, I've got 3 degrees. I'm an engineer. I've got a master's degree in engineering and an MBA as well, and I also have what you're referring to as an ICD.D, so an Institute of Corporate Directors Director designation from the Raman School of Business, which is that formal education that you're talking about. But I think today there's a lot of discussion, just more broadly across industry. If you were starting your career over, would you just go to a sort of a trade school? But today trades can be the typical trades because there's lots of activity. There's a shortage of good tradespeople everywhere: carpenters, plumbers, electricians. And you can make a great living, right? The world is growing. There's all kinds of opportunity, but as well, more of the sort of the technical trades, software programming, graphics design, computer imaging, just pure artistic design to feed into computer programs and games and all of that. And just digital marketing. A lot of these skill set that are needed now, you can learn in a sort of what we would call a traditional college diploma, or some people are learning them on their own and just getting work experience and going to work. I'm not saying I necessarily advocate for that, but I am questioning, do you need the formal 4-year typical college degree? And then today people say that 4 years is not enough, then people go get their master's degree, etc. I mean, it has served me well, but it's not something that I think everybody has to have. So that's one side of it. So this ICD.D program, the director program, I think part of it is the providers of the education saw an opportunity to improve the educational level of directors, and then created this program, which is good. I mean, I went through it, but there's a little bit of it. There was an opportunity, so business stepped in, the schools and are filling that need. So that's if anything's negative, I sort of look at that as, okay, that's maybe the negative side. But on the positive side, do you get different skill levels of directors? Absolutely. Should they all come to a common level? Absolutely. But there are some great directors. In fact, probably most great directors don't even have that formal director training. They were in roles in their careers that provided them the information and the knowledge and the working experience that gives them the great judgment and wisdom that is needed for a board member. Just going and studying, like any degree, let's say, does not necessarily make you good in that role until you've had an opportunity to sort of work in sort of the real application. So these education programs are good. I've got them myself, the Institute of Corporate Directors. You do learn a lot, but you also have to apply it and practice it. And I've seen people with the education that are not good directors because they don't have the experience and they don't have the real empathy to understand what that real job of that CEO is like. And quite frankly, there's really the one single most important role that a board has is choosing and managing that CEO, because that CEO is the horse that's running that business. And the CEO, brings everybody else and manages everybody else. So the board really only has one employee, which is the CEO. This board should make sure that CEO has all the resources he or she needs. And in order to be a good director, there needs to be some sort of empathy and understanding of what that CEO's role is like. And just going to school, yeah, it can do it for some, but for most, they don't necessarily need the school. If you got a combination of both, of course, that can hurt.
George, if you were given advice to an executive who is considering becoming a board director, what if you could give them 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice, what would that be?
One, maybe the educational route. I mean, if they, so an executive, profiling what you're saying, I'm assuming the person's, been there, done that. They got some sort of skill set, knowledge area that they're kind of a specialist in, and they've got some education and wisdom to bring to the table. If they've never been a director, then yeah, going and getting the ICD degree or ICD.D diploma. It's not a degree. Can be good because the more you learn, the better anybody will be. But I wouldn't say it's a prerequisite. I would say the number one goal would be get on a board and get on a board that can use the skills and that you have, and then hone your craft based on that and bring the experience to bear that you have. But I would say for anybody that wants to be on a board, don't come with a preconceived notion of trying to fix something. I've seen too many directors join boards saying, okay, I'm going to fix that, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. It's okay holistically to say, okay, I'm going to improve, I want to improve sales, help them improve sales, or I want to help them maybe enter a new market because I think there's an opportunity, or I want them to improve diversity, or I want them to improve their environmental footprint. I mean, that's fine. That's very broad, but to go in and say, I want to do X, Y, Z, be very specific because they've kind of got an axe to grind. I'd say don't do that. But seek out board roles, look for companies that you're interested in, talk to other directors, and then go from there. You may want to go to education, but getting the education doesn't necessarily ensure a board seat. There's a lot of, I would say the majority of board roles are filled by the chair and the existing board members who know other people, as opposed to sort of finding it on some advertisement somewhere.
Nonprofit boards versus for-profit boards. What are the differences? What are the challenges?
The main difference between the two is the makeup of the board members. Typically a nonprofit board, and I think it's important to distinguish, there are 2 types of nonprofits generally. There are charities, and then there are just nonprofit companies. One of the companies I ran was a nonprofit company. It was a real estate trade association. Certainly, generated lots of money. So, but they were nonprofit status. So that's just a tax treatment. And because of the nature of the Business Corporations Act, it allows nonprofit businesses to exist if they have a mandate to basically just help their members. So nonprofit business in this context typically has membership. So think of it like trade associations that are not charities. They're there to serve their own members. So in the real estate area, like the real estate associations, they're nonprofit, but they're there to serve their members who are real estate agents. So the main difference, so setting aside charities, because that's a different animal altogether. So nonprofit sort of businesses versus for-profit businesses, the main difference that I've observed, and I've been directors in both companies, the main difference generally is the for-profit directors, and this is a generality, it's not 100%, right? But generally the for-profit directors are just more skilled, are more, they have that empathy that I talked about, they have the experience, they bring to the table the wisdom. Because when the profit motive is entered into any business, it just sharpens the thinking. And that's just a general economic principle. So the directors and the chair will typically look for the best qualified director they can get. So that just tends to elevate the board to a higher level. And typically for-profit companies, but generally speaking, for-profit companies, the directors are compensated in some way, either monetarily or equity in the company. So they have also got an incentive to pay attention to kind of do the right thing. Nonprofit boards, by the Business Corporations Act in Ontario at least, which I'm most familiar with, they select their pool of directors from their membership or from the constituents in that nonprofit. And you can get great people, and you can get also people that are sitting on the bench, so to speak, that just want to throw their hat in because they want to stay busy. Some of those people that are not, you're not choosing them because they're qualified, they're chosen because they got elected because they're available. They may require a little bit more work to try to get them up to speed. And some of those people will come up to speed and there's no problem. But sometimes other times it's really just the wrong candidate. So it's more about the pool of available directors. For-profit companies, the pool of available directors is the world, and a lot of companies will take that serious. They will scour the world to get the best directors for-profit companies. For nonprofit companies, the pool of directors is typically that ecosystem inside that nonprofit, and it's just the law of numbers are going to reduce the number of people that are truly qualified, and that's why you see a lot of nonprofit companies will have directors will stay on. They'll be there for whatever the term is, 1, 2, 3, 4-year term. And then they often get reelected in there for a long time. And that creates an issue too, especially if the people have got there because they were just available. So that's how I would characterize the two differences.
I'm curious, on any board, nonprofit or for-profit, is it a good idea to turn over the directors on a regular basis every so many years?
I would say it's important to have it well defined what the term of the board members are and the term of the chair. And I don't think there's an ideal answer in terms of the number of years. It really depends on the nature of the business. Because if the board is really doing its job effectively and is high performing, you're going to have fantastic people on that board and you won't want them to leave. But everybody times out at a certain point. I mean, physically, mentally, or just their level of interest. If they don't want to be there anymore, there shouldn't be anything that sort of forces them or kind of people encourage them to stay if they really don't want to be there. So they may just want to move on their own volition. But I would say there needs to be something around defining what those terms are so everybody knows what the rules are. But I don't think there's a clear answer on what, an exact number. But I think the governance document does need to be clear on how board members can be removed. Just like it needs to be clear on, the CEO, if the CEO is not performing. But there needs to be clear on how the board members are removed, what that process is, if they're not doing their job. And that it can be things like attendance at meetings, things that are measurable like that, but as well, the judgment that they bring to the table and the evaluation. A good board is they evaluate themselves, and they also have a sort of a 360-degree evaluation. The CEO and any senior management that attended board meetings could also provide input. These things there's always plus and minuses of all this, but a good board also measures its own performance and holds itself accountable.
at this point, you've moved beyond boards, or you're not as involved. You've started a new company, Revalio. Tell us what that's all about and where's it going?
Providing more transparency, specifically in the residential real estate area, because consumers are spending a lot of money on housing, but we provide information for consumers to stay informed themselves. So what's their property worth, or what's that property worth if they're looking at a house, So we're trying to build a platform that provides that information for consumers, starting with what's my house worth, and then working all the way through on that asset as they continue to own it through their lifetime, to help them optimize the value of that and manage that, and provide the best tools for our agents to serve consumers in the way that they want to be served today. That's what Revalio.com is all about.
So it sounds to me like people might use Revalio almost like it's like if you'd ask Google, what's my house worth?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we want to make it as simple as that. There's no strings attached. You can go to Revalio.com, type in a street address, currently in Toronto, and we're expanding across other markets soon. Type in the street address and it will return what we think the value of the property is.
George, let's imagine you have a chance to talk to a new CEO. A company's hired a new CEO. They start work next week. And what 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice would you give that CEO to get the relationship with the board and the chair in particular off on the right foot?
So number one step, meet with the chair, have a great conversation, get to know them, come to common understanding. Second thing I would do as a CEO is get the chair's approval, because you don't want to, and some chairs are more sensitive than about this, but the best chairs aren't sensitive to this, is just get the chair's approval. You can meet one-on-one with each of the other directors and talk to them, because you want to have a relationship with every director. At the end of the day, the law states that each director is equally responsible for this company legally. It's not just the CEO and the chair. It's each director, including the chair, including the CEO. So make sure they understand the CEO has an opportunity to talk with each director, have that similar kind of dialogue. Less about frequency of communication, perhaps in that case, because the chair and the CEO will be the ones that determine the frequency of communication between the board and the chair, but have just a get together and understand key priorities and get together with a person. And then the third thing that I would do as a CEO is make sure, that the CEO pretty much memorizes, all the corporate governance documents. If there's a board of governance, a manual that governs the way the board operates, of course, any bylaws and procedures that the company has, the CEO needs to be intimately familiar with those things, because there are times when the company will be in situations, specific words in those documents will matter. And of course, the corporate lawyer will be heavily involved in advising and counseling the board in those matters, as well as the CEO. But the CEO needs to know what those, going back to the concept, the guardrails are. So those would be the 3 things.
My guest today is George O'Neill, reminding you that the board chair should be nose in, fingers out.
If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.